Today we are going to discuss choosing the best flop bet size in no limit Texas Hold'em. This is something that gives a lot of players a lot of trouble. Some players think they should always bet pot, or some think they should always bet half pot. Some just bet randomly, and if you do that, you're going to leave a lot of money on the table. Before we discuss finding the perfect flop bet size, let's discuss range advantage, because this is a vitally important concept that will heavily impact your bet size and frequency. The range advantage is the advantage that one player's likely range has over their opponent's likely range on any particular board. Some boards are going to be better for some players' ranges compared to other players' ranges. I'll give you an example in just a second. This is the number one concept that will determine how often you should bet, your betting frequency. If your range advantage is small or non-existent because the board's just not that good for you and therefore good for your opponent, you should be betting less often, not frequently at all. If your range advantage is large, though, meaning your range is just a little bit better than your opponent's range or a lot better than your opponent's range on a particular board, then you're going to be betting more often, more frequently. Your bet size is determined by a few main concepts. First, the nut advantage, the range connectivity, the stack depth, and the general board dynamics. However, there's also a general relationship between frequency and size. In general, this is not always true, but in general, as you bet more frequently, because you have a range advantage, you usually are going to bet using a smaller size, something like 33% pot or less. And as you're betting less frequently, meaning you don't have a range advantage, meaning when you do bet, you're betting usually just your best hands and your high equity draws and maybe some junky draws. Usually then you're going to be betting larger, something like 50% to 100% pot. The main time this does not hold true are on the boards that are the absolute best for your range and the boards that are absolutely the worst for your range, especially in terms of nut advantage. Sometimes when the board's really, really good for you, you're going to be betting frequently and big. And sometimes when it's really, really, really bad for you, you're going to be betting infrequently and small. But for the most part, this general relationship is going to hold true. Are you a shark or a fish? Well, I'm very excited to introduce Peak GTO and the very first poker ELO score. You can battle against the bots and see how you fare, while at the same time improving your skills and leveling up from a student to a shark. Get started with Peak GTO for free right now. So, your bet size is determined by these few things, but first let's discuss nut advantage. The nut advantage is essentially something that a player has when they have more combinations of premium hands that are just happy to get all the money in, than their opponent on any particular board. So typically this is going to be something like two pair and better when stacks are deep, and something like top pair good kicker and better when stacks are shallow. When you have the nut advantage, just really, really good hands, usually you're going to be betting larger. And when you do not have the nut advantage, when you do decide to bet, usually you're going to be betting smaller. Let's take a look at some examples. Let's say 40 big blinds deep, under the gun raises with this range in red, and the big blind calls with this range in green. Consider who has more premium hands on ace, king, jack, and then in a second we're going to look at jack 7-7. Well, on ace, king, jack, notice the initial raiser has all of these hands in this region that are a pair and a draw, which is really good. They also have a lot of aces, which are really good. Hands with a 10 have a straight draw. It's not a great straight draw, but it's a straight draw. Hands with a queen have a straight draw. And then you have a few under pairs that are not so good. But notice, for the most part, this player's under the gun range is really good on the ace, king, jack. So this player has the nut advantage in this scenario, which is usually going to lead to larger bet sizes. Because if you look at the big blinds range, while they do have some of the best hands, they also have a whole lot of other hands like 8-2 of hearts, which is just not good, or 8-2 of clubs, right? They have a whole lot of total garbage. So on the ace, king, jack, the initial raiser has a big nut advantage as well as a big range advantage. Actually, in both these scenarios, the initial raiser has the big range advantage because they have aces, kings, queens, jacks, tens, ace, king, ace, queen. All those hands are pretty good, even on the jack 7-7 board, because the opponent in the big blinds are going to have a lot of total garbage, like the 8-2 of hearts. But consider who has more sevens in their range. Well, now the big blind caller is going to have a lot of suited sevens and even a few offsuit sevens. So in this scenario, on Jack 7-7, the initial raiser, when they do bet, they should be betting using a small size because they don't have the nut advantage. The big blind caller is going to have a lot of sevens. So that's going to result in the initial raiser betting using a big size on the ace king jack because they have the nut advantage, but a small size on the Jack 7-7 because they do not have the nut advantage. Let's take a look at a few examples. Here, the low jack raises, that is first position six-handed, and the big blind calls. Flop comes 10, 8, 5. The big blind checks. Here is what the low jack should do. Notice in this scenario, they do have a bit of a range advantage. 57% is a decent amount, so they are betting kind of frequently. They do have a lot of really good hands, too. Notice they have over pairs, which are pretty good 40 big blinds deep. They have some good top pairs, right? They have some sets. So they have a lot of pretty good hands. And they also have a lot of draws. So this is a spot where on 10-8-5, they have, to some extent, a bit of a range advantage and a bit of a nut advantage. And that's going to result in them betting frequently using mostly large sizes, either 100% pot or 67% pot. By the way, you can find all of these charts in Peak GTO. Make sure you check it out. What about on Jack 5-5, though? Notice now the player has more equity. The low jack has more equity in this spot, so they have even a bigger range advantage, but they lack the nut advantage. Notice they have almost no fives in their range. So because they have almost no fives in their range, when they do bet, they are betting using a small size, mostly 1.5 big blinds or 25% pot. So notice, they have more equity in this spot, 60% compared to 57%. So they're favored a little bit more, but because they lack the nut advantage, they don't have all that many fives, and the opponent does, they have to bet small. Next, let's discuss the idea of range connectivity. Essentially, you want to ask yourself, how strongly does this board hit your opponent's likely continuing range? Like, if they have something, is it just pretty decent? When your opponent's range connects well with the board, meaning they usually have like a pair and a draw, or a pair, or a high equity draw, something like that, you're going to be betting larger. And when your opponent's range connects poorly with the board, usually something like Jack 6-2, right? On those boards, typically you're going to be betting smaller. And to be clear, this usually only matters when you have both the range and the nut advantage. You have both the range and the nut advantage when your opponent's likely to have something decent. When they do continue, you're going to be betting bigger. When they're going to have something kind of marginal when they continue, you're usually going to be betting smaller. For example, you raise under the gun and the big blind calls and it comes ace, king, jack. Should we bet big or small? We just looked at this scenario. This is a spot where you're going to want to bet large because consider what the opponent's going to check call the flop with. Well, it's going to be an ace, which is good, a king, which is good, a jack, which is good, or something like queen 9 of hearts for a gut shot straight draw and backdoor flush draw, which is also pretty good. So in this scenario, because the hands they're continuing with is pretty good, this is usually a spot you're going to want to bet on the bigger size. Consider what happens though when it comes Jack 6-2. Should we bet big or small? Well, now when we bet, they have to call with all sorts of stuff like Queen 10, perhaps without even a flush draw. So because they have to call with a bunch of stuff like ace high, king high, queen high, 8-7 of diamonds, stuff like that, in this scenario, you're going to be betting using a smaller size. So typically as the board is more connected, when you have both the range and the nut advantage, you're usually going to bet using a bigger size. When the board is not so connected, you're usually going to bet using a smaller size. Let's take a look at a few more examples in Peak GTO. Here, low jack raises, big blind calls, flop comes king 7-2. They check. Notice on king 7-2, the opponent's not going to have a whole lot of good hands. They're going to have a lot of stuff like backdoor straight draws and backdoor flush draws that need to stick around against a bet. So this is a spot where we have a lot of equity, so we're going to bet very frequently. We also have the nut advantage. Notice we have lots of sets, top pairs, aces. So we have the range advantage and we have the nut advantage. And because the board is very uncoordinated, such that the opponent's going to have a hard time having much on this board, we're going to be betting using a small size, 1.5 big blinds. And these patterns hold true in all sorts of common spots. And notice, I'm not recommending you memorize these charts. Not at all. I'm recommending you memorize these rules so that when the flop comes queen 7-2, you know it's going to play kind of similarly to the king 7-2. And you're going to be able to use these rules to figure out how to play roughly the GTO strategy in a lot of common spots that you will encounter over and over and over again. What about on the King, Queen, 10 board? Now, you raise low jack, they call, they check the flop. Notice now their range connectivity is much better. We have, again, a lot of equity. We have the nut advantage. But in this spot, we're going to be betting using a bigger bet size about half the time. So notice, while we are mixing it up to some extent with a lot of these hands, we are betting bigger a lot of the time when we do decide to bet, because the opponent, when they do continue, will have some sort of a pair or draw that is clearly decent. Now let's discuss stack depth. Your stack depth, or the effective stack depth, determines the stack off threshold. That is the point at which a hand becomes strong enough such that you are just happy to get all the money in. For example, say you have pocket tens on 8, 7, 4. Would you rather get it all in for 40 big blinds or 80 big blinds? Well, obviously, 40 big blinds. Pocket tens on the 8, 7, 4, 40 big blinds deep is good enough to play for all the money. 80 big blinds deep, if your opponent wants to put in all the money, it becomes a lot worse. 300 big blinds deep, it becomes far worse. And that's going to impact your strategy substantially. Essentially, the deeper stacked you are, the more nutted your hand needs to be for you to put that type of hand into your nut advantage. Because pocket tens on the 8, 7, 4 could be the nuts, the effective nuts. Whenever you have 20 big blinds, right, you're just never folding it. But 100 big blinds deep, it's not really the nuts. It's okay, it's decent, but you don't want to play for all the money. So as stacks get shallower, essentially what qualifies as a hand that is part of the nut advantage, there are more hands that qualify, right? Let's take a look. Here we are, 40 big blinds deep, low jack raises, big blind calls, flop comes 8, 7, 4. In the spot, when they check, you're going to bet kind of infrequently. Notice we don't have a whole lot of equity. That's because if you consider the big blinds range, they're going to have a lot of hands that connect with a pair or a draw on this board, because they're defending a lot of middle and low cards. And notice we don't have a whole lot of those. We have a lot of unpaired high cards. So we're not going to bet very often. But when we do bet, we're going to bet using a big size with our hands that are almost always good but vulnerable. That's going to be our overpairs and our good eights. And some draws. That's going to be stuff like ace 6 of spades, ace 6 of diamonds, king 5 of spades, king 5 of diamonds, overcards with flush draws and backdoor flush draws. Stuff like king jack with the king of spades. All these hands can bet using a big size. Okay? Notice here we are betting about 40% of the time. Consider what happens, though, if we're 80 big blinds deep. We've only changed the fact that we are 80 big blinds deep compared to 40. So we were checking 57. Now we're checking 56, but take a look. Now we are betting using smaller sizes to some extent. So why are we betting smaller in this spot? Well, it's because we no longer want to just get it in with our hands like pocket 10. So notice before we were betting pot a lot of the time, 40 big blinds deep, because we're just pushing our strong hands. We're pushing the equity they have into the pot. Here, though, we have to be a little bit more cautious with these type of hands, right? Notice here, 10s, 9s, jacks, queens are betting almost every time. Now they're checking a large chunk of the time. And when they do bet, they're betting using a smaller size because these hands essentially don't count as the nuts anymore. And that's very, very, very important to note. Finally, the board dynamics are very important as well in determining your bet size. Essentially, you want to ask how likely is the board to change on future streets such that the current nut hands are vulnerable to being outdrawn. And as the board is more likely to change, often that's going to result in you betting larger with your hands that are almost always good but vulnerable. And when you have a large nut advantage, the more vulnerable they are to being outdrawn, the larger your bet size will typically become. Let's take a look at some examples of this. Here we have low jack raises, 40 big blinds deep, big blind calls, ace queen 2, 2 spades. Notice in this scenario, we are using some pretty big bets, right? Pot size sometimes, 67% pot size, because this is a spot where if we do have an ace, it's almost always good, but it's very vulnerable to being outdrawn. Notice any spade, king, jack, 10, maybe a 5 or a 4. All of these are quite bad for you. So when you do bet in the spot, you're betting using a big size. And notice some of the hands that really prefer to bet big are hands like ace king, ace queen, ace jack, right? These hands that are very, very strong. Also, hands like jack 10, for a gut shot, like to bet big too, because when you bet the jack 10 and your opponent folds out anything, it's usually a pretty good result. So you're betting big with hands like ace king, ace jack, ace 10, and then also some bluffs. Compare that over here to ace king 10 without a flush draw. Now notice we're betting a little bit more often, but we are never using the big size. That's because hands like ace king in the spot are a little bit less likely to get outdrawn because there's not a flush draw available. Plus, we just have more equity and a bigger nut advantage in general. Notice we have more equity. We have, to some extent, more nut hands because we have all sorts of combinations of really good stuff. And for that reason, we get to bet more often, but using a smaller size because the current strong nut hands are likely to remain strong on the turn and river. Essentially, when there is a straight draw or a flush draw available, like on ace queen 2, you're going to be betting less often using a bigger size. But when there is not a flush draw, or there's a straight draw, a straight already available, if there's a flush or straight already available, like here, notice the queen jack's already the nuts, and it's going to stay the nuts by the river for the most part. In these scenarios, usually you bet using a smaller size, but more often. So when there's a flush draw and or straight draw, but no flush or straight yet, you'll be betting less often using a bigger size. When there is a flush or straight available already, you're going to be betting more often using a smaller size. And I realize here 2/3 pot's not big, but that's because you have a big range and nut advantage. So look, that's it. I realize that there is a lot to choosing the proper bet size, but if you take these factors into account, the nut advantage, how well your opponent's range connects with the board, the stack depth, and how likely the board is to change, that's going to go a long way to helping you figure out what size you should be using on the flop. So if you need to, go back and rewatch this video. Study it hard. If you have a friend who always uses one bet size on the flop or just kind of splashes around randomly, send them this video. It will change their poker life. If you enjoyed today's video, do me a favor, click the like and subscribe button down below. Click the notification bell. If you haven't already, make sure you check out peakgto.com because you will see these patterns repeat over and over and over and over. And you can use the Peak GTO trainer to go through and train these spots so that you make sure you are playing well in all the common spots you are likely to encounter. Thanks for watching. Good luck. And I'll talk to you next time.